All right, it's time for another mailbag. You've got questions, I got some answers, including who I think is going to be on the staff going into next season. That's coming right up.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, and welcome to Locked On Irish, your daily Notre Dame podcast. Today is Friday, November 17th, so happy Friday, and thank you for making this your first listen of the day. I'm your host, Tyler Wojciak. I graduated from Notre Dame in 2018, and now I'm a producer covering college football for Fox Sports. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use code LockedOnCollege for our first deposit match up to $100. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The everyday listeners know that Friday episodes are reserved for the mailbag, and we got a bunch of good questions to get to today. Thanks to everyone who sent their questions in. I didn't get any questions specific to the Wake Forest game, but if you want to listen to some preview content to get ready for the game tomorrow, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to Thursday's episode. Once you're done with this one, I had Ryan Roberts on. He's from Irish Breakdown, and we previewed the game, and it was a lot of fun, so you should go check that out if you have not listened to it already. All right, now let's get to the mailbag questions, and not surprisingly, we got quite a few about the offensive coordinator situation, so let's start with a couple here. This one comes from @DrewBrennan77. What would you put the odds at for Gerad Parker being back as offensive coordinator next season if he were to go? Any candidates you like? I got another one from Matthew Kempf, 21, who asks, will we have a new offensive coordinator next season? So I won't bury the headline. Right now, I think there is a 65% chance that Gerad Parker is going to be the offensive coordinator for Notre Dame next season. Let me explain. I'm not saying this is what I think should happen, but I think it's what's going to happen. I think there's multiple factors to consider here, and I think I'm partially responsible for maybe jumping or going a little overboard after the Clemson game, saying that changes are going to happen, that this was rock bottom. Now that I've had some time to think about it and talk to some other people who are in the know, I expect that Gerad Parker is going to be the offensive coordinator next season, in part because I think that Notre Dame is going to win these next two games comfortably, and depending on who they play in the bowl game, they have a real chance to finish this season 10-3 with an offense that will finish in the top 15 in points per game and yards per play. And I understand that a lot of that came against teams who are not very good. I get it. I've gone over the context before, and I've explained that Notre Dame has only scored 19 points per game against teams with top 50 scoring defenses, but that's just a small piece of the equation, okay? I don't think Marcus Freeman has made up his mind. I think he's probably talked with Gerad Parker. I think he talked with the entire offensive staff over the bye week to try to figure out what's been going wrong for the team, specifically going up against the better defenses on the schedule. But if Notre Dame were to win 10 games this season, I just don't think that Freeman is going to fire his offensive coordinator, especially a guy who Freeman clearly thinks very highly of as a coach. I know that he wasn't his first choice as offensive coordinator. Hell, we all saw that based on how that process went down during the offseason. It seemed like Colin Klein, Andy Ludwig were Freeman's top two options. It didn't work out, so then he promoted Gerad Parker. He didn't have to promote Parker. It wasn't like, well, now I have no choice. He made the decision to elevate him, so he clearly thinks highly of him there. Also, once Freeman became the head coach, Tommy Rees wanted a different tight ends coach, but Marcus wanted Parker on his staff. He's a guy that he's coached with in the past. He clearly trusts him, so he's like, no, I want him on as tight ends coach. They made the hire, and then a year later, he's the offensive coordinator. So for that relationship to just go away after a year of lackluster performances against the top defenses, I don't think it's enough in the mind of Marcus Freeman to fire him. I also think that play calling on this Notre Dame team is a very collaborative process. I think it involves quarterbacks coach Gino Gadulli, who is a guy with offensive coordinator experience. Dylan McCullough is very involved in the run game, and specifically what run plays are called when Parker wants to run it. I think Joe Rudolph is involved too. He's had experience calling plays. And I think that they're all at fault here, including Chancey Stuckey as well, who I have not mentioned yet. I think they're all responsible for the lackluster play by the offense, the lack of execution, the lack of creative play calling in certain moments. I think it's a collaborative effort, so then they're all partially responsible for why this unit has not had success. So if Marcus Freeman is going to look at this entire offense and say, well, they're all a part of this, is he just going to eliminate Gerad Parker just because he's the guy who's calling the plays in? I don't think so. I think the players are also responsible. And when Freeman refers to execution or the lack thereof over and over and over in his press conferences. That's what he's saying. Okay, he's saying that the players are not making the plays that needs to be made, and Marcus Freeman is not the type of coach who is ever going to throw his players under the bus. But if you read between the lines there, when he's referring to the lack of execution, it means that the players on the field are not making the plays, or they're not doing what they're supposed to in order for the offense to work. And Freeman has said it time and time again now. So I think that part of it is on the players, and part of it is on the players, right? The offensive line has been underwhelming so far this season. Hartman was really bad against Clemson, and Hartman took all of the ownership for that after the game in his post-game press conference. But if Hartman is missing on like 10 plays, that's not Jared Parker's fault. That's on Hartman. Now, Hartman has been better in other games, and I think part of the reason why Hartman has struggled is because of the lack of creativity by the play callers. But still, that's a part of it. We already know the problems at wide receiver. Notre Dame is trotting out 3 true freshmen most of the time, or at least in some key moments there against Clemson. They're without Jaden Thomas, who's wide receiver 1. They're without 2 of their key rotation guys in Deion Colzie and Matt Salerno. And the player who had the best breakout season on offense, Mitchell Evans, Hartman's most trusted target, is now out for the season, and he missed the Clemson game. So all of this plays a part in the decision by Marcus Freeman into whether or not he's going to retain Jared Parker or decide to make a move after this season is over. I think there's another thing to consider. The administration is clearly showing patience with Marcus Freeman despite some struggles over the course of the first 2 seasons of his head coaching career. Like, let's be honest. If Brian Kelly had stuck around and he was the head coach of Notre Dame last season and they had the exact same results, and then Notre Dame had the exact same results this season, everyone would be calling for Brian Kelly to be fired. But that's not happening now, right? Because Marcus Freeman is only in his second year as head coach. We all understood that when Freeman was promoted that there was going to be a learning curve. So I think the fan base is a lot more patient, as is the administration. So if no one's calling for Freeman to be fired because we all understood that he was going to have to learn on the job, why do we think that Freeman isn't going to show the same level of patience with Jared Parker, who is in his first year as the offensive coordinator? And that's something that Freeman knew when he promoted him. And I get it. Like, there's certainly a reason, or there's certainly an argument to be made. Well, he didn't want him in the first place, so he's going to be more willing to make the move. I get that. I think that's true, but I don't think the offense has been bad enough in the eyes of Marcus Freeman in order to make the move. Again, this might seem like I'm defending Jared Parker or I think he should stay. I'm just saying how I think Marcus Freeman is going to view this decision, which is why I think ultimately Marcus Freeman is going to decide to retain Jared Parker under the assumption that Notre Dame will win these next 2 games. If Notre Dame loses to Wake Forest and the offense puts up like 17 points, it's going to be a whole different conversation, right? But I don't think that's going to happen. I think Notre Dame is going to win these next 2 games comfortably. Personally, I'd probably prefer a more experienced offensive coordinator. I think Marcus needs like an Al Golden of the offense, an experienced coach who's been around football for a really long time, who's called plays and had success while doing so. And I think head coaching experience would be preferred because Marcus Freeman is still a very young coach. And I think that having a guy like Al Golden on the staff on defense has been very beneficial for that group, and we've seen it on Saturday. So if he were able to get that on offense, I think that would just be great for the team. But the circumstances are what they are, and I don't think Freeman is the type of coach who's going to make a move like this after one season, especially if there's a good chance that the team is going to finish 10-3. Again, this is not a defense. This is just what I think is going to happen. All right. I went a little bit long on that one. Let's go a little bit quicker on this next question here. This one comes from @mremy13. Do you think we'll see any coaching changes besides offensive coordinator for next season? I think we'll definitely see some turnover on the staff because that happens practically every single year. And a lot of times it's guys you don't expect. Let's look at the staff turnover after last season. Offensive coordinator Tommy Rees left to take the job at Alabama. Brian Mason, the special teams coach, left to become the special teams coach for the Indianapolis Colts. Harry Hiestand decided to retire once Tommy Rees was out the door. Even though James Laurinaitis wasn't technically the linebackers coach, he basically acted as one, even though I think he was technically considered a graduate assistant. He left. He went back to Ohio State. That's a loss. And then Matt Bayless, the director of football performance, a.k.a. strength and conditioning coach, is also included in that list, even though he decided to make that move very late in the calendar, I should say. More on Matt Balis in a bit. We also know that Chancey Stuckey, the wide receivers coach, running backs coach Dylan McCullough, and safeties coach Chris O'Leary were all approached by NFL teams last offseason. They all decided to stay at Notre Dame, obviously. And Mike Mickens got a promotion in terms of title, and we assume a pay raise along with it, which to me suggests that he was probably getting courted by some other teams. Maybe they wanted him to be on their staff in college or NFL. I don't really know, but based on that promotion, that usually means that the staff is doing whatever they can to keep a guy on board by giving him a raise and a better title. So I think turnover is expected. I've said this time and time again, especially in the offseason, that when an NFL team or other Power 5 programs want to hire your position coach, especially if it's for coordinator positions, that's a sign of a healthy program. So as for Notre Dame, let's look at who I think is most likely to leave. And I'm not saying this is a guarantee that they'll be gone. I'm just saying that if they were to leave, it certainly wouldn't surprise me. Al Golden, the defensive coordinator, he's a Broyles Award finalist. He's going to be getting a ton of looks by everyone else in college football and potentially the NFL as well. We know about his NFL background. He was the linebackers coach for the Cincinnati Bengals before he took the job at Notre Dame. I think if Golden were to be offered a defensive coordinator position in the NFL, he's as good as gone. I don't think he'll leave for another defensive coordinator position in college. I don't really think he wants to be a head coach right now. I could be wrong. He's only 54 years old, so if he wants to give it another crack, and there's a team on the East Coast that wants him to be their head guy, maybe he goes there, but I'm not sure. I don't know if he wants to do or invest in recruiting that much because he's got a really good situation going on at Notre Dame. So I think right now he's probably more likely to stay, but it's probably like 55% chance he stays, 45% chance he goes at this point in time. Mike Mickens is another guy, Notre Dame's cornerbacks coach, who's going to get a lot of looks. Could there be a Power 5 program that wants him to be defensive coordinator? Well, if Al Golden stays on as DC at Notre Dame, is Notre Dame going to be able to offer him a raise or a better title that's going to be able to keep him around as opposed to going and becoming a defensive coordinator somewhere else? I don't know, but that's something that I could definitely see happening. Running backs coach Dylan McCullough, we know he has an NFL background, won a Super Bowl with the Kansas City Chiefs. He's been pretty open about the fact that he wants to be an offensive coordinator or even a head coach, or he could just go back to the NFL. Hell, I think after Notre Dame hired him, or I guess it wasn't official yet, he almost went to the Giants to work with Brian Daboll. It didn't happen, but I could definitely see Dylan McCullough leaving for the NFL as well. Gino Guidugli, quarterbacks coach. This would be a bit of a surprise to some, but I think that he could potentially be offered an offensive coordinator position, and if that's the case, he'd likely take it. That's a bit better than just being the quarterbacks coach for Notre Dame. And then there's safeties coach Chris O'Leary, who has been around Notre Dame for a really long time. He's one of the lone holders from the previous regime under Brian Kelly, and he got some NFL interest this offseason, and I just think that the average span of a position coach at one school is so short these days that he's already exceeded it, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if he decided to leave and go elsewhere after this season. Two guys who I would be surprised if they just left on their own accord are Jared Parker, for obvious reasons, and then Joe Rudolph, the offensive line coach. I think he's got a really good position at Notre Dame, and he's only been there for one season, so if he were to leave, that would kind of catch me by surprise, but you never know, man. We didn't expect Tommy Rees to be the offensive coordinator at Alabama, and that's exactly what happened. You never really know with these things, but I'm expecting there to be some staff turnover, and that's not the end of the world. I know how some fans are going to react to it, but again, I think that's the sign of a healthy program. All right. We've talked a lot about staff decisions on the podcast so far, but there's one decision that I don't think is being talked about nearly enough. I'll explain what I mean right after this. This episode of Locked On Irish is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is a skill-based, real-money daily fantasy sports game. You've heard me talk about PrizePicks before. I've had so much fun playing it during the football season, and now you can play during basketball season too. You just select two or more players and pick more or less than their projected stats, and then you place your entry. PrizePicks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second half, that player is rebooted. PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy, and that's just one of the reasons why I think it's the best daily fantasy game out there. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege, code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks, daily fantasy sports made easy. Before we continue, this is a reminder to please hit that thumbs up button below if you're watching on YouTube and subscribe to the channel, or if you're listening to the podcast, please take a moment to rate the show 5 stars, leave a nice review, and of course, subscribe. It really does go a long way in helping out the show, so I appreciate everyone who has done that already. All right, let's get back to the questions here. This one comes from @DougShear7907, who asks, What is ex-Notre Dame Director of Performance Matt Balis doing since he left Notre Dame? Are there any plans to make changes to the strength and conditioning staff? Who might they add to strengthen, pun intended, the strength and conditioning coaching staff? Thank you, Doug, for asking this question. It's a really good one. It's something that I've been wanting to talk about for a little while now, and I also like the pun there at the end. But let me start off by saying I have no idea what Matt Balis has been doing since he left Notre Dame. I'm still not even sure why he left in the way that he did. That remains a mystery to a lot of us. I've asked some people who I thought might be in the know, and the answer I got was either I have no idea either or stop asking. So I stopped asking. Maybe one day we'll find out the answer, but right now I couldn't tell you. Marcus Freeman did address the search for Balis' permanent replacement in his press conference on Thursday, though, so we have a little bit more insight into that. Freeman said that once the Stanford games, the search process to hire that full-time replacement will really kick into high gear, which makes sense. They're going to wait till season's end. And Fred Hale, who was elevated to Balis' position, he was an assistant on the staff. He is going to be interviewed for the job, and he's going to have a chance to be that full-time guy. But based off what Freeman said in the rest of his press conference, I don't think that Hale is going to get the job. Not that he did a poor job or anything. I think he did everything that he was asked to do during the season, but the role of the strength and conditioning coach during the season is not nearly as important as it is in the offseason, and I think Freeman wants a guy who's more experienced. He also said that he's looking for someone who is, quote, forward-thinking and also, quote, cutting edge of strength training and sports science. So I can't really provide any more context on what Fred Hale offers in that regard, but I think that Freeman wants a guy who's been a strength and conditioning coach for a Power 5 team for several years, and odds are he's probably going to be a sitting strength and conditioning coach somewhere else, or at the very least like a high-level assistant for maybe a pro team or a really top-level college football team. So I think that's the route that Freeman is going to go. Right now, I don't have a list of like potential hires for you, but I can tell you that this is an extremely important hire because over the past few years, we've talked a lot about the culture within the Notre Dame football program, right? Not just me. The players talk about it all the time. The coaches, everyone who covers the team talk about the culture, right? And it's really hard to quantify what culture is, but clearly it's been something that Notre Dame has sort of prided itself on in recent years. And I think that Matt Balis was the leader of that. He was the primary person responsible for the culture within that Notre Dame locker room, and he's a major reason why it was what it is. And now that he's gone, they're huge shoes to fill. And if Freeman is going to look for someone from the outside, it's going to change the culture in that room. It's just the way things work, right? He's going to be a new voice. He's going to bring a different style. He's going to have a different plan, a different way of thinking, all of that, a different way of relating to players. So when you bring in someone from the outside who is taking over a position that is extremely important to the success of the team, it's a very critical hire. And in the offseason, like the players don't have a ton of time with the Notre Dame coaches on the staff. They spend the bulk of their time with the strength and conditioning staff. So whoever Marcus Freeman decides to hire is going to be instrumental in establishing not necessarily a brand new culture, but a new foundation, right, for the rest of the Marcus Freeman era, because Matt Balis was around before Marcus Freeman was around. And once Brian Kelly left for LSU, Matt Balis decided to stay, and Jack Swarbrick made the rather unprecedented decision to retain Matt Balis no matter what. Like, they're like, we need to have this guy around the team, and they didn't even know who they were going to hire as the strength, or as the head coach, I mean. It obviously worked out because they promoted from within, and they kept Marcus Freeman, who obviously had a relationship with Matt Balis, but that's rare. Very rarely do you see an athletic director keep one guy on staff, let alone a strength and conditioning coach, and say, hey, whoever I hire next is going to have to keep this guy around because he is just that important to this team in that locker room. So now that he's gone, Freeman has a huge decision to make, and that person is going to have a lot to do with how successful Marcus Freeman is the rest of the way. Obviously, there's a lot of other factors that are going to determine how successful Marcus Freeman is down the road, but that is a very crucial one, and I'm going to be very interested to see who he ends up hiring. Okay, next one here. From, I think this is Ander Season 5321. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. He asked, what freshman that has played this year are you the highest on going forward? For me, it's Jeremiah Love. Love has been pretty productive so far this season. He's second on the team in rushing yards and has really just shown elite acceleration and burst. His best game of the season also came against the best defense that Notre Dame has played all year. I'm kind of confused why he hasn't gotten nearly as much action since that game, considering how good he looked. He's gotten like carries here and there. He's gotten some opportunities, but I also understand that when you have a guy like Wojciak, you want to keep giving him the ball because he's one of the best running backs in the country. But I feel like Jeremiah Love offers different things to the table there because he's just so fast. And I think, to me, he's got future, first or second, third round NFL draft pick written all over him because he's got the size and speed that, frankly, Notre Dame hasn't had a ton of at running back. Like, I absolutely loved Kyren Williams, but he didn't have like the straight line speed that Jeremiah Love has, and I think Jeremiah Love is a little bit bigger than him. And Kyren Williams is having a ton of success for the Los Angeles Rams right now in the NFL, and I think that if Jeremiah Love sticks around and he continues to develop, he could be one of the best running backs Notre Dame has had in a really long time. And Notre Dame has had some good running backs, whether I feel like people in the national media don't give Notre Dame enough credit for that, but guys like Kyren Williams, Wojciak, they've been really good players at the college level. But don't sleep on Rico Flores. I think it's really telling that Rico Flores has basically become Sam Hartman's most trusted receiving threat now that Mitchell Evans is out. Flores is third on the team in receptions and receiving yards. He had the go-ahead touchdown against Ohio State, and if Notre Dame were able to get a stop there at the end, we're talking about that touchdown in Notre Dame lore. That's like one of the biggest touchdowns in Notre Dame history. He also had a huge 2-point conversion against Duke. I think he's going to be a really good player in the future. I don't know if he's got like the measurables to be a top NFL draft pick. Now, maybe he develops them along the way, but I think he has a chance to put up a ton of numbers in college as he continues to develop. And sure, there's been times this season where you're like, oh, that wasn't a great play by Rico Flores. Maybe he could have had a better route on the ball or made a contested catch or things like that. But you have to remember that he is still a true freshman getting a ton of reps out there. And on a better team, he probably wouldn't be getting so many reps. And it's easy to think that like, oh, this true freshman who I see all the time isn't that good, where there's a lot of other really good true freshmen who aren't playing at all because there's older, better players in front of them who aren't making those mistakes on the field on Saturday. So you don't even know. You're not even judging that player because they're not on the field. Whereas Rico is put in a position where he is playing all the time, probably a little bit more than he should, but the circumstances are what they are for the Notre Dame wide receiver room. So he's out there, and he's even though he's making some mistakes, he's also learning and developing a lot along the way. On defense, I think I would say Christian Gray. I've loved what I've seen from him so far. His interception against Pitt was like an unbelievable display of athleticism, but because of some other plays in that game, it was maybe like the third best play of the day. I think Christian Gray is going to start alongside Benjamin Morrison next year at cornerback. I think he has a really bright future, and there's probably several teams from Notre Dame in the past decade that he probably would have started on as a true freshman. But considering how good this Notre Dame cornerback room is right now, Christian Gray hasn't seen the field a whole lot, but I think his future is really bright. All right, next question here. This one stays on the topic of freshmen. It comes from @rfritz40. What are your thoughts on Drake Bowen? Could he be the next great Notre Dame linebacker? I think he's going to be a really talented player. We haven't seen as much from him as the other guys because there's 3 fifth-year senior linebackers ahead of him, although he is listed as J.D. Bertrand's backup at the Mike linebacker. So unless Notre Dame goes out in the portal and adds a veteran Mike linebacker, it looks like Drake Bowen is going to be the starting linebacker for Notre Dame next season, unless J.D. Bertrand surprises us all and decides to come back to Notre Dame for a 6th year. So he's going to have a great opportunity to really make a name for himself at a young age. And even though I have my concerns about playing a sophomore at the Mike linebacker position, which is so crucial to the success of the defense, I think that Drake Bowen, based on everything I've heard about him, he's the type of player who's going to do whatever it takes to learn and study the playbook as much as he possibly can so that he can have success when he's thrown into the fire next season. But also, don't sleep on Jaden Osbury. He's another freshman linebacker who's going to have a chance to make a name for himself next year as well. He's listed as the backup at Rover, and depending on what Notre Dame does or if Jack Kaiser decides to say, I think Osbury could be playing a lot next year as well. So those are 2 guys at the linebacker position who might be playing a lot more as sophomores, even though we haven't seen a lot from them this season. All right, we got a few more questions left, and I think it's time to revisit the historic night that ensued after Notre Dame knocked off Wake Forest way back in 2012. There's some really exciting stuff going on for us here at the Locked On Podcast Network. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. All you have to do is go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Now time for your Game Changer of the Week, brought to you by Athletic Brewing Company. Xavier Watts has been Notre Dame's biggest game changer lately on defense. He now leads the country with 7 interceptions, so he's my Game Changer of the Week. Much like Xavier Watts has done for the Notre Dame defense, Athletic Brewing has completely changed the non-alcoholic beer game. They make non-alcoholic beers that actually taste good. They're full of flavor and well-crafted, just like a full-strength beer. And you can find Athletic Brewing Company's non-alcoholic brews at a store near you or buy online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers can use code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off at athleticbrewing.com. Near beer, exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company, fit for all times. Okay, I think we got time for a couple more questions here, and this first one comes from Luke Smith, big friend of the program. He asks, in honor of the 2012 Wake Forest Notre Dame game and the chaos that ensued that night, power rank the top 3 establishments in South Bend in terms of gross sales that night. Really great question by Luke, and I'm sure we'll address it on Tuesday's pod. But for me, I think number one's got to be Finney's, a.k.a. Old Finney's, a.k.a. Blarney Stone. That's been like the upperclassman bar for a really long time. And you got to remember, in 2012, like if you've been to Notre Dame recently, it looked a hell of a lot different way back in 2012. I don't think Eddy Street was even around back then. A lot of the newer establishments around campus were not a thing. So I'm just going to think back on the places that have been there through thick and thin, through years and years of South Bend. Number one on that list, at least that night, is probably Finney's. I would say CJ's is probably a close second. CJ's is a bar right down the street from Finney's, and it's a popular student bar. And on Saturday nights, at least when I went there, that's where we always went to. So I think those two are probably the top because I think all the students were out and about celebrating that night. And number 3, you got to go with Old Reliable, the backer. I don't know what the dynamic was for the students back then. I don't know if students were really hitting the backer that much. It feels like whenever I go to the backer, it's usually a lot of older alums. And when I was at the Ohio State game, me and all my friends were at the backer. Shout out to the Falkenbergs, partial owners of the place. We even had backer stickers all weekend. And I feel like I have gone to the backer more since I graduated than I did as a student. But I think that night, man, it was a really special night in South Bend. I'm sure they got a ton of business. So I'm going to give Finney's the nod there, but I could be wrong. But I wanted to share a quick story from that night. I was actually at the Wake Forest game with my family. And then after the game, we watched the night games. I believe Baylor was playing Kansas State, and Kansas State was ranked number 2 in the country at the time. They got smoked by Robert Griffin III. He ended up basically winning the Heisman with that game. And then Oregon got smacked too. I think they were the number 1 team in the country. We're watching all of these games at a Buffalo Wild Wings. And then as it's happening, the wheels start turning. You're like, oh my God, Notre Dame is going to jump up from 3-1 overnight after a big win on senior day. And even the game itself, even though Notre Dame smacked them, I think the final score was like 38-0. It was a really special game to be a part of because it was Manti Te'o's senior day, and after his historic senior season, all the students were wearing leis and all that stuff. It was just a really, really fun time. One of my all-time favorite games to go to. And then once you realized Notre Dame was going to be number 1 and they were going to light up Grace Hall, my family and I left our hotel. We went back to campus just to walk around, and there was a buzz. All the students were out celebrating, and I'm sure they were a little bit intoxicated. They were probably going to Finney's or CJ's or the back or any of these 3 places I just named at the time. But it was a really, really cool scene. There were people like jumping in the fountains and all that. And then we were around Sunday. I don't even remember why we stuck around for an extra day, but we walked around campus again, and the buzz was still there. It was incredible. It was the first time Notre Dame was number 1 in football in a really long time. And looking back, we kind of got screwed because if Kansas State had won that game and they had made it to the national championship, Notre Dame would have beaten that Kansas State team, and we would be talking about a national championship team in 2012, which probably didn't deserve it based on what we saw in South Beach going up against Alabama. But still, I don't care if they would have been, the most deserving team. If they had won it, that's all I would have cared about. We would still be talking about that game for the rest of our lives. Okay, last one here. This one also comes from Drew Brennan, 77. What would Notre Dame's record be with a healthy Jaden Thomas in the lineup for the first 10 games? My guess is 8-2 or even 9-1. That was Drew guessing that. Okay. I think it's a good question to ask. I honestly don't think it would have changed that much in terms of the actual outcomes, though, because one player to completely change the outcome of a game has to be really, really impactful. And I think that having Jaden Thomas would certainly do a lot to help the Notre Dame offense. I don't think he's that caliber of a player that would have just ultimately switched those games. But let's look at it. So let's look at the Ohio State loss. Thomas played 30 out of a possible 65 offensive snaps in that game. Some of that is by design because of the rotation, but he did miss the bulk of the second half. I don't remember the play where he went down, but his absence is very detrimental to Notre Dame, but still they had a chance to win that game. And I wouldn't put his absence as the reason why they lost. I think that has more to do with the fact that Notre Dame did not convert that screen pass, which would not have gone to Jane Thomas. It was always going to a running back. Or if the defense were able to get a stop on 3rd and 19 or put 11 guys on the field, for the final play of the game. Let's move ahead to Louisville. Jane Thomas would have helped, but he wasn't going to stop Louisville's defensive line from getting constant pressure all night long and shutting down Notre Dame's run game. Could the Irish have been more effective passing the ball down the field if Thomas had played? Sure, but Hartman needs time to do that, and he wasn't getting any time at all that night. So that one was just a weird game. I don't think there's anything that Thomas could have done in that game to change the outcome there. I think, Drew, you probably have the best case against Clemson because Notre Dame was only down by 8 points for the bulk of that game, or at least the bulk of the second half. And Notre Dame passed the ball a lot in that game. They just did not have anyone to throw to. Maybe Thomas could have come in and made a play, and the offense would have gotten some sort of a rhythm, something that they didn't have for pretty much the entire game. And Hartman just didn't have anybody to throw to without Mitchell Evans the first game that he was out. So Thomas could have come up big in that game, but would it have been enough to completely change the outcome? I'm really not sure because Hartman just was off that day. Maybe you could make the case that if Hartman was able to build some confidence by hitting Jane Thomas on some plays, maybe he would have played better as a result. But I just think that's a bit of a stretch here. So Thomas would have definitely helped the offense. It would have looked better, but I still think that they would have lost all of the 3 games that they ended up losing. All right, that's going to do it for this episode, and that is another week of Locked On Irish in the books. Thanks again for making this your first listen of the day. If you're not subscribed to the show already, please hit that subscribe button on the way out. You can also follow the program on social media, and I hope you enjoy the game tomorrow. Look, man, we only get 13 of these a year, so enjoy it, especially on Senior Day when we're going to watch a lot of our favorite players suit up for the very last time in Notre Dame Stadium, and that is definitely not something we should take for granted as fans. So I will be back with you early next week to react to the game, share my takeaways, reaction, all that. So until then, go Irish.